What if the most dangerous move in this entire story didn't happen before the murders, but after? Sit with that for a second. Because when people hear about a brutal crime inside a wealthy, well-known family, the mind immediately jumps to one moment. One night, one act, one suspect, one arrest. We're trained to believe that once the police tape goes up, the story freezes in time. But what if that assumption is wrong? What if the real chaos didn't erupt in the moments leading up to the deaths, but in the quiet, overlooked days that followed? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Tonight's story doesn't begin with bloodshed. It begins with movement, with access, with timing, and with a question that refuses to go away. Why would anyone return to a secured crime scene after investigators had already locked it down? This is the question now swirling around the Reiner family. And according to claims attributed to Jake and Romy Reiner, it's the question that could change everything. Not because of what allegedly happened during the murders, but because of what may have happened afterward. Let's slow this down. 2 people are dead. A son has been arrested and charged. A family is shattered. And yet, that's not where the controversy ends. Because buried beneath the shock headlines, beneath the grief statements, beneath the public silence, is a quieter allegation. One that doesn't scream, but whispers. One that suggests that after law enforcement had already secured the estate, someone may have tried to interfere with what was left behind. If that sounds alarming, it should. Because in criminal investigations, what happens after a crime can matter just as much as what happens during it. Sometimes more. Now, before we go any further, we need to be very clear about one thing. What you're about to hear involves allegations, reported claims, and questions raised by family members, not conclusions, not verdicts, and not proven facts. This is a developing narrative shaped by statements, timing discrepancies, and reported concerns. Nothing more, nothing less. But even allegations, when they involve evidence and access, deserve scrutiny. So let's start at the beginning, or at least what everyone thought was the beginning. On a Sunday in December, authorities responded to a shocking discovery at a multi-million-dollar estate in Brentwood. Inside the main residence, a married couple, both elderly, were found dead. Investigators later described the cause of death as multiple sharp force injuries, and the manner as homicide. Those words alone sent shockwaves through the public, not only because of the violence involved, but because of who they were, where they lived, and who was connected to that property. This was not a random address, not a nameless household, not a family without history. This was a prominent, deeply connected family with public visibility, wealth, and decades of reputation behind them. And almost immediately, attention turned inward. The couple's adult son, who lived in a guest house on the property, was arrested that same night and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The speed of that arrest stunned many people. Some saw it as decisive. Others saw it as alarming. But either way, the narrative quickly crystallized. Son arrested. Parents dead. Case closed, at least in the public imagination. Except real life doesn't work that cleanly. Because while the public focused on the arrest, other family members were processing something else entirely. According to reports, the bodies were discovered by the couple's daughter. And in the immediate aftermath, she allegedly made a statement to law enforcement that would later raise eyebrows. She reportedly warned police about a dangerous family member. Think about that. In a moment of shock, grief, and trauma, she didn't point outward. She pointed inward. Now, that alone doesn't prove anything. Families under extreme stress say many things. Fear distorts perception. Instinct overrides logic. But that remark would later take on new significance, not because of who it implicated, but because of what followed. Because once the scene was secured, once the evidence was logged, once investigators had established control over the property, the expectation was that nothing inside that estate would change. That's the whole point of securing a crime scene. No movement, no interference, no contamination. Every object becomes a silent witness. And this is where the story takes a turn that almost no one saw coming. According to claims later attributed to Jake and Romy Reiner, there was concern that someone attempted to return to the estate after law enforcement had already locked it down. Not to grieve, not to retrieve personal necessities, but allegedly to remove, disturb, or interfere with items inside the home. If true, that's not just suspicious. It's explosive, because evidence doesn't have to be dramatic to be critical. It doesn't have to be bloody. It doesn't have to be obvious. Sometimes it's a document, a device, a piece of clothing, a container, a small object that only matters once it's gone. And when something is missing from a crime scene, the absence itself becomes evidence. Here's the part that should make you pause. These concerns weren't raised by strangers. They weren't fueled by internet speculation. They were reportedly raised by immediate family members, people who knew the house, knew who had access, knew what belonged where. People who would notice if something didn't look right. So ask yourself this. If you were grieving the violent loss of your parents, would you risk public scrutiny by raising concerns about evidence interference unless you truly believed something was wrong? That's the question viewers keep coming back to. And it's why this story refuses to settle. Because while one narrative focuses on the night of the murders, another focuses on the days after. On doors that allegedly opened when they shouldn't have. On timestamps that don't align with expectations. On movements that reportedly raised red flags. And at the center of those concerns is a name that, until recently, wasn't part of the public conversation at all. Tracy Reiner. To be clear, no court has ruled on these allegations. No charges related to evidence interference have been announced, and no conclusions have been reached. But according to claims attributed to Jake and Romy, the concern is serious enough that they believe the damage, at least within the family, is irreversible. It's over. That's the phrase now circulating. And phrases like that don't come lightly. They don't come from misunderstandings. They don't come from simple disagreements. They come from a belief that something fundamental has been broken. Trust, loyalty, the line between grief and responsibility. And here's what makes this story even more unsettling. In many high-profile cases, families close ranks. They protect one another. They stay silent. They handle conflict behind closed doors. But in this case, the fracture appears to be happening in public view. Which raises another question. Why now? Why speak up at all? The answer, according to those close to the situation, may be fear, not of headlines, but of history repeating itself. Because once evidence is gone, it doesn't come back. Once a timeline is altered, it can never be restored. And once doubt enters an investigation, it spreads. This isn't about proving guilt. It's about protecting truth. And that distinction matters more than people realize. So tonight, we're not here to decide who is innocent or guilty. We're here to follow the trail of questions, to examine the moments that don't fit neatly into press releases, to explore why two siblings would allegedly risk tearing their own family apart by claiming that someone crossed a line after the crime scene was sealed, and to ask the question no one wants to ask out loud. What if the biggest mistake in this case wasn't made on the night of the murders, but in the silence that followed? Because according to what Jake and Romy would later claim, the most suspicious activity didn't happen under cover of darkness. It happened when everyone thought the danger had already passed. And what comes next may be the detail that changes how this entire story is understood. What if the moment that mattered most wasn't the one everyone was watching, but the one almost no one noticed? Because while the world was still trying to process the shock of what happened inside that Brentwood estate, something else was unfolding quietly in the background. Something subtle, something procedural, something that would later become impossible to ignore. This is the part of the story that doesn't involve sirens or headlines. It involves timing, it involves access, and it involves the fragile hours when a family is frozen between disbelief and reality. Let's go back, not to the arrest, not to the speculation, but to the night the family says everything stopped making sense. The night the house went silent. According to reports, the discovery was made on a Sunday. The kind of Sunday that usually feels slow, uneventful, predictable. But for this family, it became the dividing line between before and after. Inside the main residence of the estate, two lives had already ended. What remained was shock, confusion, and a question that no one ever wants to ask inside their own family. How did this happen here? Romy Reiner was the one who reportedly found the bodies. Just imagine that moment. The familiarity of the space. The weight of recognition. The instant understanding that something is terribly wrong before your brain can even catch up. There is no preparation for that. And in those first moments, people don't think like detectives. They think like daughters, like sons, like human beings in freefall. But even in the chaos of that discovery, something reportedly stood out. According to accounts, Romy allegedly told responding officers that there was a dangerous family member, not a stranger, not an intruder, a family member. That single detail would later echo through everything that followed. Now pause here for a second and ask yourself something honestly. If you were in her position, shattered, overwhelmed, barely able to breathe, what would compel you to say that out loud? Fear, instinct, knowledge you didn't yet know how to explain? We don't know the answer, and anyone pretending they do is lying. But what we do know is that from the very beginning, this was never just a whodunit. It was a what else is going on here. As law enforcement took control of the scene, the estate transformed instantly. What had once been a home became a controlled environment. Every room, every object, every surface was now potential evidence. This is a detail many people gloss over, but it matters. When a scene is secured, it's not symbolic. It's literal. Movement is restricted. Access is logged. Nothing happens without documentation, or at least it's not supposed to. That's why what allegedly happened next has become such a focal point. According to later claims attributed to Jake and Romy, there were concerns that someone attempted to return to the house after it had already been locked down. Not just return, but interact with the space. Let that sink in, because crime scenes aren't just about what's visible. They're about what stays exactly where it was when everything stopped. And the moment something moves, the clock rewinds in all the wrong ways. Now here's where the story gets uncomfortable, because the person whose actions were allegedly questioned wasn't a suspect in the murders. Not initially, not publicly, not in the way the arrested son was. This was someone close, someone trusted, someone whose presence wouldn't automatically raise alarms. And that's exactly why it matters. Think about how evidence interference actually works in real life. It's not dramatic. It's not a frantic scramble. It's quiet, deliberate, sometimes even justified in the moment. People tell themselves they're cleaning up, or protecting privacy, or handling family matters. But investigators don't care about intentions. They care about outcomes. Did something move? Did something disappear? Did something change? According to the claims circulating now, the answer might be yes. And if that's true, the implications are enormous. Because this wasn't just any house. This was a sprawling estate with multiple structures, multiple points of entry, and multiple layers of access. The main residence, the guest house, the surrounding property, each one tells a different part of the story, and each one has its own timeline. While public attention fixated on the guest house, where the son lived, far less attention was paid to what was happening inside the main home after the initial discovery. Who came and went, who had keys, who had authorization, and most importantly, who noticed when something didn't look right. Jake Reiner, according to those close to the situation, was among the first to express concern. Not publicly at first, not dramatically, but privately, quietly, persistently. The kind of concern that doesn't go away when you try to explain it off. And Romy, having already experienced the trauma of discovering her parents, allegedly began connecting dots that didn't sit well. It wasn't one thing. It was the accumulation. A door that shouldn't have been opened. A room that looked different. An item that wasn't where it was supposed to be. Small details. But small details are where cases live or die. Here's the contradiction that keeps resurfacing. If the scene was secured, how could anything change? And if something did change, how did it happen without someone noticing? This is where security logs and timestamps enter the conversation. Modern estates don't rely on memory. They rely on systems. Keycard access, security cameras, digital logs that quietly record everything. And while we don't have public access to those records, the mere allegation that such logs exist and may show activity after the lockdown is enough to raise serious questions. Because digital systems don't grieve. They don't forget. They don't reinterpret events through emotion. They simply record. And if those records show movement when there should have been none, the story shifts dramatically. Now, to be clear, none of this proves intent. It doesn't prove wrongdoing. And it certainly doesn't prove guilt. But it does explain why tensions inside the family reportedly escalated so quickly. Because grief can unite people, but suspicion tears them apart. Imagine sitting across from someone at a table, knowing that you're both mourning the same loss, but believing that one of you may have crossed a line that can't be uncrossed. What do you say? What do you do? Do you stay silent to preserve the family name? Or do you speak up to preserve the integrity of the truth? According to Jake and Romy's reported stance, silence wasn't an option. And that's where the phrase, "it's over," comes into play. Those words don't describe anger. They describe finality. They describe the moment you realize that even if nothing illegal is ever proven, something moral has already been lost: trust. And here's the part that makes this even more complicated. From the outside, people want villains and heroes. They want clean lines. They want someone to blame. But inside families like this, the reality is messy. There are decades of history, old resentments, unspoken loyalties, private knowledge the public will never see. Which means that when siblings accuse someone of interfering with evidence, it's not just a legal statement. It's a declaration of war. And wars don't start without reason. So ask yourself this. Why would Jake and Romy allegedly risk everything? Public scrutiny, family backlash, legal exposure. If they didn't believe something critical had been compromised, what did they see? What did they notice? What convinced them that this wasn't just grief talking? Those answers may still be unfolding. But one thing is already clear. This story was never just about the night of the murders. It's about what happened when the house should have been frozen in time, but allegedly wasn't. Because once you believe that evidence may have been touched, moved, or removed, you can never unsee that possibility. And from that moment on, every timeline becomes suspect. Every explanation feels incomplete. Every silence grows louder. And according to those close to the family, this was only the beginning. Because the next phase of this story doesn't focus on what was found. It focuses on what might be missing. And once that question enters the room, nothing stays contained. Not the investigation, not the family, and not the truth. What happens when grief turns into doubt, and doubt turns into suspicion? Because that's the moment this story crosses a line most families never come back from. Up until now, everything could still be explained away. Shock, trauma, confusion. The kind of emotional chaos that follows an unthinkable loss. But according to what Jake and Romy would later suggest, there came a point when explanations stopped working. And that point arrived with a single, chilling realization. Something didn't add up. Not emotionally, not procedurally, not logically. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. This is the phase of the story where silence becomes dangerous. Because after the estate was secured, after investigators believed the environment was controlled, after the public narrative had already begun forming, questions started surfacing inside the family that didn't match what everyone else thought they knew. Let's talk about what it means to secure a crime scene for a moment. In television shows, it's dramatic. Yellow tape, flashing lights, officers guarding doors. But in reality, it's far more methodical and far more fragile. Securing a scene means freezing a moment in time. Every object becomes evidence. Every absence becomes suspicious. Every movement becomes a potential problem. Which is why, when Jake and Romy allegedly began comparing notes, what they noticed wasn't one big red flag. It was a pattern, a series of small inconsistencies that didn't scream, but whispered. And whispers are often the most dangerous sound in an investigation. According to claims attributed to them, the first unease came not from what was said, but from what wasn't. Certain details were glossed over. Certain timelines were unclear. Certain explanations felt rushed. At first, that's easy to dismiss. Families in shock don't communicate clearly. People misremember. Trauma scrambles sequence and perception. But then came the contradictions. One person said something happened earlier. Another said it happened later. One person recalled being present. Another insisted they weren't. Normally, these discrepancies fade with time. Here, they sharpened. Jake, according to people familiar with the situation, began asking quiet questions. The kind of questions you ask when you don't want to believe the answers. Who went back into the house? When? With whose permission? And most importantly, why? Because in a case like this, there is a clear dividing line. Before the scene is secured, confusion reigns. After it's secured, there are rules. And allegedly, someone crossed that line. The concern wasn't about mourning. It wasn't about personal items. It wasn't about emotional closure. It was about interference. Now pause here and ask yourself something uncomfortable. If you truly believed nothing inappropriate happened, would you be able to calmly explain every movement? removing an item from a room, cleaning a surface, relocating an object. Actions that feel harmless in isolation can have serious consequences in context. And according to what Jake and Romy allegedly feared, context was exactly what had been compromised. There were reportedly concerns about items being removed or altered before investigators had completed their work. Again, these are allegations, not conclusions. But even the suggestion of such actions changes everything. Because intent becomes secondary. In law enforcement, outcome is king. Was evidence altered? Yes or no? And if the answer is yes, the ripple effects are massive. Investigators are forced to question the integrity of the entire scene. Defense attorneys gain leverage. Public trust erodes. And families implode. This is the emotional heart of the conflict. Jake and Romy weren't just reacting to a single act. They were reacting to the possibility that the truth, the only thing that could bring clarity, might have been compromised. And that fear is corrosive. It eats away at compassion. It replaces grief with vigilance. It turns conversations into interrogations. Suddenly, every interaction feels loaded. Did they mean that? Why did they say it that way? What aren't they telling us? According to people close to the situation, this is when communication broke down entirely. Not in screaming matches. Not in dramatic confrontations. But in cold distance. Texts unanswered. Calls unreturned. Meetings avoided. The kind of breakdown that doesn't make headlines, but destroys families quietly. And then came the realization that this wasn't staying private. That investigators were asking their own questions. That logs might be reviewed. That witnesses might be interviewed. And once that process begins, there's no putting the toothpaste back in the tube. Which brings us to a critical contradiction. If nothing inappropriate happened, why did the situation escalate so quickly? Why didn't reassurance resolve it? Why didn't transparency calm the storm? That's the question Jake and Romy's supporters keep asking. And it's why the phrase, "it's over," reportedly wasn't said in anger, but in resignation. Because at some point, they believed the line had already been crossed. Not legally proven, not publicly confirmed, but emotionally irreversible. This wasn't about winning an argument. It was about protecting the integrity of what remained. The truth, the investigation, the memory of their parents. And once they believed those things were at risk, reconciliation stopped being possible. But here's the twist that few people saw coming. According to emerging reports, investigators weren't just looking at what may have been moved. They were looking at who noticed it. Witnesses. People who were present before and after. People who could say, "That wasn't there before." Or, "That shouldn't have been touched." And once witnesses enter the picture, the narrative becomes far more dangerous. Because memory can be challenged, but multiple memories form patterns. And patterns tell stories. Stories that don't always align with the official version. This is where the stakes escalate dramatically. Because now, the issue isn't just family disagreement. It's potential contradiction between personal accounts and recorded data, between what was said and what was logged. And that gap is where investigations widen. According to those following the case closely, this is the moment when Jake and Romy realized there was no going back. The moment they understood that even if no charges ever came from these allegations, the damage was done. The trust was gone. The unity was shattered. The silence was broken. And once silence breaks in a case like this, it doesn't stop echoing. Because next comes comparison. Whose story holds up? Whose timeline shifts? Whose account changes under scrutiny? And as those comparisons begin, another uncomfortable truth emerges. Sometimes, the most revealing evidence isn't physical. It's behavioral. Who avoids questions? Who deflects? Who overexplains? Those patterns don't prove guilt, but they fuel doubt. And doubt, once planted, grows. According to sources close to the situation, the next phase of this story would focus not on objects, but on people. On who said what. On who changed their version. On who contradicted themselves when the pressure increased. And once that process starts, there is no controlling the outcome. Because narratives collapse under scrutiny. And the next chapter doesn't ask what was moved. It asks who noticed and why. And when witness statements begin colliding with timelines, the truth stops being quiet. It demands attention. And what comes next would force the family to confront a question none of them were prepared to answer. What if the biggest threat to the case wasn't the suspect, but the silence that followed the crime? What if the truth wasn't hiding in what was taken, but in who noticed it was gone? Because once investigators start listening to witnesses, the story stops being abstract. It stops being emotional. It becomes precise. And precision is where things get dangerous. Up to this point, the fracture inside the family could still be dismissed as grief colliding with suspicion. Understandable. Human. Tragic, but not unusual. But according to those close to the situation, everything changed when attention shifted away from objects and toward people, toward statements, toward memories, toward timelines that refuse to align. This is the phase where stories either stabilize or fall apart. Let's talk about witnesses. Not strangers, not neighbors, but people who were already inside the orbit of this family. People who had been on the property before the discovery. People who had returned after. People who could say, with confidence, what looked different. Witnesses don't have to see a crime to matter. They only need to see change. A room that felt altered. An item that had been moved. A container that was suddenly empty. Those are the details that trigger deeper scrutiny. And according to reports circulating among those following the case closely, that scrutiny didn't come from one direction. It came from multiple. Jake and Romy, as the story goes, weren't acting alone in their concern. They were comparing impressions. Quietly at first. Almost reluctantly. Have you ever had that moment where you say something out loud, half joking, half worried, and the other person goes silent? That silence is telling, because it means they were thinking the same thing. That's reportedly how this began. Not with an accusation, with a shared unease. Someone said, "Doesn't it seem like something's off?" And the other didn't disagree. Instead, they added another detail, another inconsistency, another question. And once that exchange happens, the floodgates open. Because suddenly you're not alone in your doubt. You start replaying conversations. You start re-examining moments you brushed off. You start noticing what you didn't want to notice before. According to those close to the siblings, this was when they began documenting things. Not formally, not legally, but mentally. Who said what? When they said it. How their version changed. Because here's the thing about witness statements. They don't need to be lies to be revealing. They just need to be inconsistent. And inconsistency is where pressure builds. One account places someone inside the house at a certain time. Another places them elsewhere. One suggests permission was granted. Another implies it wasn't. Each contradiction by itself might mean nothing. Together, they form a pattern. And patterns are what investigators follow. Now, put yourself in this position for a moment. Imagine believing that evidence tied to your parents' deaths may have been disturbed. Not out of malice, maybe out of fear, panic, or misplaced loyalty, but disturbed nonetheless. What would you do? Would you confront the person directly? Would you stay silent and hope it didn't matter? Or would you make sure the right people knew there were questions that hadn't been answered? According to Jake and Romy's alleged stance, silence felt like betrayal. Not of a person, but of the truth. And this is where emotions escalate. Because once witnesses begin talking, everyone starts watching how everyone else reacts. Who becomes defensive? Who avoids eye contact? Who suddenly remembers things differently? Behavior becomes evidence adjacent. Not proof, but signal. And signal is powerful. This is also where the public narrative begins to diverge sharply from the private one. Outside the family, the story seemed straightforward. Inside, it was anything but. Conversations grew tense. Assumptions hardened. Trust evaporated. And once trust is gone, every action is suspect. A delayed response feels intentional. A vague answer feels calculated. A simple mistake feels strategic. This is how families unravel after trauma, not with explosions, but with erosion. According to reports, the siblings began to worry that if they didn't speak up, someone else would. And that person might not be careful, or accurate, or fair. Better to raise concerns responsibly than let speculation spiral. But raising concerns has consequences. It changes how people look at you. It changes how the story looks at you. And it draws a line you can't step back over. That line, according to those familiar with the situation, was crossed when investigators began comparing witness recollections with available data. Not conclusions, just comparisons. And comparisons are unforgiving. Because when two sources tell different stories, the question becomes unavoidable. Which one is wrong? Or more unsettling, which one is incomplete? This is also where the idea of intent begins to matter less than impact. You don't need malicious intent to cause damage. You only need to interfere at the wrong moment. And if witnesses believed that moment had passed, If they believed the scene had already been compromised, the emotional fallout was inevitable. That's when the phrase "destroy evidence" started circulating, not as a legal determination, but as an emotional shorthand, a way of expressing fear that something irreplaceable had been lost. Truth has a way of becoming symbolic in moments like this. Evidence isn't just evidence. It's justice. It's closure. It's the difference between certainty and doubt. And when people believe that's been tampered with, the reaction is visceral. According to sources close to the family, this belief hardened when witness statements began to overlap, multiple people noticing similar discrepancies, multiple accounts pointing to the same window of time, multiple impressions aligning in uncomfortable ways. Not enough to prove anything, but enough to terrify anyone who cared about the integrity of the investigation. This is the point where the siblings reportedly stopped hoping for reassurance. They started preparing for confrontation. Not a public one, a private one. Questions were asked directly, clarifications were requested, explanations were demanded, and this is where the emotional temperature spiked. Because when you're asked to explain your actions under suspicion, even innocence can feel like accusation. Voices rise, defenses snap, old wounds resurface. The conversation stops being about what happened and becomes about why you don't trust me. That shift is fatal to reconciliation. Because once the issue becomes trust, facts alone can't fix it. According to those familiar with the exchange, this was when communication fractured completely. Not all at once. In stages. A meeting that ended early. A call that wasn't returned. A message left unanswered. Each silence louder than the last. And with every unanswered question, certainty gave way to resolve. Resolve to protect the truth, even if it meant losing family. This is when Jake and Romy allegedly reached the conclusion that nothing could go back to normal. That even if investigators found no wrongdoing, the damage was already done. Because the belief that someone interfered, rightly or wrongly, had poisoned the well. And poison wells don't get cleaned. They get abandoned. But here's where the story takes another unexpected turn. Because while the family was imploding privately, something else was happening quietly. Investigators were expanding their scope. Not dramatically, not publicly, but methodically, looking at who had access, looking at who spoke to whom, looking at who noticed what and when. And as that process unfolded, one uncomfortable reality became clear. Witnesses weren't just observing the past. They were shaping the future of the case. Every statement mattered. Every recollection mattered. Every inconsistency mattered. And the family knew it. Which is why the next phase of this story isn't about grief or doubt or suspicion. It's about pressure. The kind of pressure that makes stories crack. Because when investigators begin cross-referencing timelines, even the smallest deviation becomes significant. A 5-minute difference. A misplaced hour. A vague answer instead of a precise one. Those details don't fade under scrutiny. They multiply. And according to people tracking the case closely, the moment investigators started applying that pressure, something shifted again. Because suddenly, the question wasn't just what may have been moved. It was who was willing to stand by their story, and who wasn't. And when that distinction becomes clear, the truth stops being abstract. It becomes unavoidable. Because the next chapter isn't about what witnesses saw. It's about how their stories held up when the pressure increased. And once pressure exposes cracks, there's no hiding them. No matter how powerful the family, no matter how quiet the estate, no matter how much everyone wishes it would all go away. Because when timelines collide, something always breaks. And what breaks next may be the detail that changes everything. What happens when pressure turns polite stories into interrogations? Because that's the moment where everything people thought they remembered starts to wobble. Up to now, the cracks were subtle. Quiet. Easy to dismiss if you wanted to keep the peace. But according to those watching the situation closely, the calm didn't survive the first real wave of scrutiny. This is where timelines stop being casual recollections and start becoming tests. And not everyone passes. Let's talk about pressure. Not the dramatic kind you see on TV, but the slow, suffocating kind that builds when the same question is asked again and again and again. What time did you arrive? Who was with you? How long did you stay? Which door did you use? At first, answers come easily, almost automatically, but then they're asked a second time, and a third, and that's when something strange happens. Details shift, not dramatically, not obviously, just enough to raise eyebrows. A time moves forward by 10 minutes. A visit becomes shorter than it was before. Someone who was definitely there becomes, I think they stepped out. These aren't lies, necessarily. They're stress fractures. And stress fractures are exactly what investigators look for. Because when people are telling the truth consistently, repetition reinforces clarity. When they aren't, or when they're protecting something, they get slippery. This is where the alleged contradictions surrounding the post-scene access began to take shape. According to sources close to the matter, certain accounts about who entered the main residence after the lockdown didn't line up when revisited under pressure. One version suggested a brief entry. Another implied extended time. One explanation framed it as necessity. Another framed it as incidental. Each version alone might sound reasonable. Together, they clash. And clashes are impossible to ignore once you see them. Jake and Romy, according to those familiar with their mindset, were not just reacting emotionally at this point. They were watching something unfold that felt procedural. Something that reminded them this wasn't just a family matter anymore. It was becoming a record. And records don't care about intention. They care about consistency. This is where discomfort escalates into alarm. Because once investigators start mapping timelines visually, placing statements side by side, patterns emerge that no one can talk their way out of. A claimed entry at one time overlaps with another person's recollection. A supposed exit conflicts with a digital timestamp. A justification doesn't match the sequence. And suddenly, the conversation shifts from what happened to why doesn't this line up? That's a dangerous shift. Because once that happens, innocence doesn't rest on character anymore. It rests on data. And data is merciless. According to reports, this is when family members realized the issue wasn't going to disappear quietly. Questions weren't going away. Clarifications weren't enough. The margin for error was shrinking. And here's the psychological twist most people miss. When someone believes they've done nothing wrong, they expect the process to validate them. When that validation doesn't come immediately, frustration builds. Defensiveness creeps in, and defensiveness is often misread as guilt, even when it isn't. But perception matters, especially when witnesses are watching not just what you say, but how you say it. Do you answer directly? Do you qualify every response? Do you bristle at repetition? Those reactions become part of the narrative. And according to those close to Jake and Romy, reactions began to matter more than answers. Because while no single response proved anything, the overall tone raised concern. Shortened replies, irritation, a sense that questions themselves were inappropriate. That dynamic doesn't reassure anyone. It escalates tension, and tension changes everything. At this point, the siblings were reportedly facing an impossible choice. Push harder and risk blowing the family apart publicly, or step back and live with the fear that something important had been lost forever. There's no easy answer to that, because backing off feels like complicity, and pushing forward feels like betrayal. This is where the phrase, "we can't ignore this," begins to circulate. Not as a threat, not as an accusation, as a line in the sand. And once that line is drawn, neutrality disappears. You're either on one side or the other. According to people familiar with the fallout, this was the moment alliances shifted. Not officially, not formally, but emotionally. People stopped sharing information freely. Conversations became guarded. Every interaction felt transactional. Who knows what? Who's talking to whom? What's being documented? That's when trust truly collapses. Because trust depends on openness. And openness doesn't survive suspicion. Here's another uncomfortable truth. In situations like this, silence becomes strategic, even if it wasn't intended that way. Choosing not to answer a question can feel like protection, but it can also feel like concealment. And the difference depends entirely on perspective. Jake and Romy, according to those close to them, began to feel that silence was doing more harm than speaking out. Not because they wanted drama, but because unanswered questions don't stay unanswered. They get filled in by speculation, by rumor, by imagination. And imagination is far more dangerous than truth. So they did something many families would never do. They let the conflict breathe. They allowed the questions to exist, even if it made everyone uncomfortable. And that decision changed the trajectory of the entire situation. Because once, those words didn't signal anger. They signaled acceptance. Acceptance that whatever trust once existed had been replaced by something else. something fragile, something conditional, something that couldn't support a relationship anymore. According to those close to Jake and Romy, that realization was devastating, but clarifying. Because once they accepted that the family dynamic was broken, they stopped trying to preserve it at all costs. They focused instead on preserving the process, the investigation, the facts, the integrity of what remained. And that focus came with consequences. It meant distancing themselves from anyone they believed might compromise the truth, even unintentionally. It meant tolerating public misunderstanding. It meant enduring private backlash. But in their minds, the alternative was worse. Living with doubt. And doubt is a slow poison. Here's where the story tightens even further. Because as pressure mounted, investigators reportedly began revisiting earlier assumptions, not reversing conclusions, re-examining foundations. What was initially treated as settled began to look less so under the weight of inconsistencies. Again, this doesn't mean wrongdoing was proven. It means questions refuse to die. And questions, once raised, don't care about reputation. They demand answers. Which brings us to the next critical turn. According to those following the case closely, the next phase didn't focus on access anymore. It focused on behavior after the questions began. Who cooperated? Who resisted? Who changed their tone? Because how people react when under scrutiny often reveals more than what they say. And as those reactions were observed, something unsettling became clear. The story people told at the beginning was not the story they were telling now. And that discrepancy, small as it may seem, was enough to shift the entire atmosphere. Because once stories evolve under pressure, the assumption of reliability evaporates. And reliability is the backbone of credibility. Without it, everything becomes questionable. Every detail, every explanation, every denial. And according to people close to the situation, this is when Jake and Romy understood something chilling. Even if the investigation never led where they feared it might, the truth was already under threat. Not from violence, from distortion. And distortion is just as dangerous. Because once a story fractures, it doesn't heal. It multiplies. And the next chapter doesn't ask what was moved or who entered the house. It asks something far more unsettling. What happens when the story you've been telling no longer survives scrutiny? And when that realization hits, even the most carefully constructed narrative begins to unravel. What happens when the narrative you've been leaning on starts collapsing under its own weight? Because that's the moment people stop talking about what happened and start worrying about how it looks. Up until now, the tension had been contained, mostly behind closed doors, mostly in carefully worded conversations and half-finished explanations. But according to those close to the situation, Chapter 5 is where containment failed, not because of a single revelation, but because of accumulation. Too many questions, too many revisions, too many moments where certainty quietly evaporated. This is the stage where stories don't just bend, they strain. And once a story is strained, every attempt to reinforce it only draws more attention to the cracks. Let's talk about narrative control. In any high-profile case, there are two stories unfolding at the same time. The official one and the emotional one. The official story is neat, linear, designed to be understood quickly. The emotional story is chaotic, messy, full of contradictions and unresolved fear. For a while, those two stories can coexist, but eventually, they collide. According to people following the case closely, that collision happened when the siblings realized something unsettling. The story being told publicly was no longer compatible with what they were seeing privately. And once you notice that mismatch, it becomes impossible to ignore. Think about how people respond when they feel their version of events is slipping out of alignment with reality. Some clarify, some double down, some retreat into vagueness, and some try to simplify everything, hoping fewer details will mean fewer problems. But simplification can be dangerous, because when you remove detail, you remove credibility. Jake and Romy, according to those close to them, began noticing that answers were becoming less specific, not more. Where once there were times, now there were approximations. Where once there were sequences, now there were generalities. Where once there were explanations, now there were reassurances. Nothing to worry about. It's being handled. You're overthinking this. Those phrases might sound calming on the surface, but to people already on edge, they sound like avoidance. And avoidance is gasoline in a situation like this. Because avoidance suggests fear, not necessarily of guilt, but of scrutiny. And scrutiny was exactly what the siblings believed the situation needed. Here's the uncomfortable truth most people don't want to admit. If nothing improper occurred, transparency should resolve everything. If transparency doesn't resolve it, people start wondering why. That's the turning point. According to sources close to the family, this was when conversations stopped being about reassurance and started being about accountability. Who approved access? Who documented it? Who informed investigators? Those aren't emotional questions. They're procedural. And procedural questions don't go away just because feelings are hurt. This is also where internal contradictions began to surface more clearly. One person described a visit as unavoidable. Another described it as optional. One suggested urgency. Another suggested routine. Those aren't dramatic differences, but they matter. Because urgency implies necessity. Routine implies choice. And choice opens the door to judgment. The siblings weren't asking these questions to provoke conflict. According to people close to them, they were asking because they were terrified of one thing, that the case would one day unravel in court. And everyone would ask why these questions weren't raised sooner. That fear changes how you behave. It makes you meticulous. It makes you cautious. It makes you relentless. And relentless questioning is rarely welcomed. This is where emotional fatigue sets in. Everyone is exhausted. Everyone is grieving. Everyone wants it to stop. But stopping doesn't fix uncertainty. It just buries it. And buried uncertainty has a habit of resurfacing at the worst possible moment. According to those familiar with the dynamics, this was when subtle pressure began to appear. Not overt threats, not commands, but emotional leverage. Appeals to unity. Appeals to privacy. Appeals to loyalty. Do you really want this out there? Think about how this looks. Is this helping anyone? Those questions sound reasonable, but they also shift the focus away from facts and toward optics. And optics are the enemy of truth. Because truth doesn't care how it looks. It cares how it holds up. Jake and Romy, according to people close to them, began to feel that the emphasis had shifted from understanding what happened to managing how it was perceived. And that distinction mattered. A lot. Because once perception becomes the priority, facts become flexible. And flexible facts are dangerous. This is where the idea of narrative preservation comes into play. Not preservation of the truth, but preservation of an image. A family image. A public image. A legacy. That impulse is human. Understandable. Predictable. But it's also corrosive. Because when image takes precedence over clarity, clarity becomes negotiable. And according to the siblings' perspective, clarity was the one thing they couldn't afford to lose. This is also the moment when outside voices began creeping in. Friends, advisors, people offering guidance, sometimes unsolicited. Be careful. Say less. Let this pass. Those suggestions may come from concern, but they also reinforce the idea that silence is safer than truth. And once that idea takes hold, trust erodes completely. Jake and Romy, as the story goes, were confronted with a brutal realization. They were no longer having a disagreement. They were in a conflict of values. On one side, containment, discretion, image. On the other, exposure, clarity, risk. Those two paths do not converge. They diverge. And once they diverge, compromise becomes impossible. This is when the emotional language hardened. Not publicly, privately. Conversations that once ended with reassurance now ended with distance. Statements that once invited dialogue now shut it down. You're not listening. You don't understand. We can't do this. Each phrase another nail. This is also where the idea of intent began to feel irrelevant to the siblings. Even if no harm was intended. Even if actions were taken in panic. Even if no law was technically broken. The damage, in their eyes, was already done. Because intent doesn't undo consequence. And consequence was exactly what they feared most. The consequence of compromised evidence. The consequence of weakened credibility. The consequence of a case forever clouded by doubt. Those fears don't disappear just because no one wants to talk about them. They grow, and they grow fastest in silence. This is the point where the phrase, "we can't trust this anymore," begins to surface. Not shouted, not declared, felt. And once trust is gone, every explanation feels self-serving. Every reassurance feels hollow. Every appeal to emotion feels manipulative. That's the tragedy of this chapter. No one needed to be lying for everything to fall apart. All it took was the belief that truth was being managed rather than pursued. And once that belief takes root, it poisons everything. According to people close to the situation, this was when the siblings stopped expecting answers. They started preparing for outcomes. They began thinking not about resolution, but about aftermath. What happens if this goes public? What happens if investigators push further? What happens if inconsistencies are exposed in court? Those aren't hypothetical questions. They're strategic ones. And they signal a shift from emotion to survival. This is also where the language of finality returns. It's over no longer meant a relationship. It meant a strategy, a decision to disengage emotionally and engage procedurally, to stop trying to preserve harmony and start preserving integrity. That decision is never made lightly. It comes at the cost of family, reputation, peace. But to those who make it, the alternative feels worse. Living with the knowledge that you stayed quiet when you shouldn't have, that you let discomfort override duty, that you chose silence over truth. According to Jake and Romy's alleged mindset, that was not an option, which brings us to the moment everything tightened. Because as narratives strained and emotions hardened, investigators began noticing something else. Not just inconsistencies in stories, but shifts in behavior. Who became cautious? Who became evasive? Who suddenly changed their priorities? And behavior under scrutiny speaks volumes, sometimes louder than evidence ever could. The next phase of this story doesn't focus on what people said. It focuses on what they did once they realized the narrative was slipping. Who adjusted? Who resisted? Who recalculated? Because when a story is no longer stable, people start protecting themselves. And self-protection leaves fingerprints. And those fingerprints are impossible to erase. What happens next is where everything accelerates. Because once investigators stop asking questions and start watching behavior, the margin for error disappears. And the family was about to discover that once attention shifts to conduct, there is no going back. No rewriting. No reframing. No undoing what's already been observed. And the moment behavior becomes the focus, the truth has a way of stepping into the light, whether anyone is ready for it or not. What happens when people realize they're no longer being listened to? They're being watched? Because that's the moment behavior becomes louder than words. And according to those following this case closely, this is where everything accelerated. Up until now, the pressure had been conversational. Questions, clarifications, requests for explanation. But at some point, that phase ends. Investigators stop asking what you remember and start observing how you move, who you call, who you avoid, what you say when you think no one is listening. This is chapter 6, the point where conduct replaces narrative. And that shift is terrifying. Because you can rehearse a story, you can revise a timeline, you can explain away inconsistencies. But behavior? Behavior is instinct. And instinct betrays people faster than any interrogation ever could. According to sources close to the situation, this transition didn't happen overnight. It crept in quietly, subtly, almost politely. Investigators didn't announce it. They didn't threaten. They didn't accuse. They watched. Who stayed cooperative? Who grew cautious? Who suddenly needed legal advice for clarity? None of those actions are illegal. None of them prove wrongdoing. But they are signals. And when signals start clustering, attention sharpens. This is where the siblings allegedly felt the temperature drop. Conversations with authorities became more formal. Casual check-ins turned into structured interactions. The tone shifted from empathetic to precise. That's never a good sign. Because precision means the margin for ambiguity is shrinking. And ambiguity is where people hide. Let's talk about how behavior changes under scrutiny. People don't usually become silent all at once. They become selective. They stop volunteering information. They answer only what's asked. They choose words carefully. That alone isn't suspicious. But when selectivity appears after inconsistencies are flagged, it raises questions. Why now? Why the change? According to those familiar with the family dynamic, this is when tension moved from emotional to strategic. Everyone began thinking 3 steps ahead. What will this look like later? Who might be blamed if this unravels? How do we protect ourselves? And here's where fear quietly takes over. Not fear of guilt, but fear of exposure. Because exposure doesn't care about intent. It doesn't care about nuance. It doesn't care about good intentions. It reduces everything to sequence and fact. Jake and Romy, according to people close to them, began to feel that something fundamental had shifted. They weren't being reassured anymore. They were being managed. Managed language, managed access, managed information. And management, in a situation like this, feels suffocating because it implies that someone believes the truth needs guidance. And guided truth is not truth at all. This is where behavior under pressure becomes critical. Who insisted on privacy? Who pushed for less detail? Who framed questions as unnecessary? Those choices may come from exhaustion. They may come from fear. They may come from a desire to protect. But to observers, they all look the same. They look like control. And control invites suspicion. According to sources close to the siblings, they began documenting not just events, but reactions. Who seemed calm? Who seemed rattled? Who grew defensive when certain topics were raised? Again, not proof, but patterns. And patterns are what investigators live for. This is also where the emotional cost becomes unbearable. Imagine realizing that every interaction with your own family might later be dissected. Every word parsed. Every pause interpreted. Every silence questioned. That's not grief anymore. That's surveillance. And surveillance changes how people behave. Some overcompensate. Some withdraw. Some lash out. None of those responses are healthy. All of them leave traces. According to people following the developments, this was when the siblings began to accept that the family would never return to what it was. Not because of the murders alone, but because of everything that happened after. The choices, the reactions, the priorities. And that realization is devastating, because it means the loss isn't singular. It's layered. Parents lost. Trust lost. Family lost. All at once. This is also where the alleged concern about damage control becomes more explicit, not in words, but in behavior. Meetings held behind closed doors. Decisions made without consensus. Information flowing in tighter channels. Again, these actions aren't inherently wrong, but context matters. And in this context, they felt isolating. Jake and Romy, according to those close to them, began to feel like obstacles rather than participants. Like their questions were inconveniences. Like their concerns were liabilities. That's a brutal position to be in, because it forces a choice. Do you fall in line, or do you stand apart? And standing apart comes at a cost. It means being misunderstood. It means being labeled difficult. It means being accused, implicitly or explicitly, of making things worse. But to the siblings, the alternative felt like complicity. And that's a line they weren't willing to cross. This is where the idea of protecting the process becomes central. Not protecting people. Not protecting reputations. Protecting the investigation. Because once an investigation is compromised, truly compromised, nothing that follows can be trusted. And that fear isn't abstract. It's concrete. It's courtrooms. It's appeals. It's verdicts overturned because of procedural doubt. That's the nightmare scenario. And according to the siblings' alleged reasoning, that nightmare was avoidable if questions were addressed honestly, early, and transparently. But transparency didn't come, at least not in the way they needed. Which brings us to another subtle but critical shift. Investigators reportedly began noticing alignment, or lack thereof, between what people said and how they behaved afterward. Words promising cooperation followed by resistance. Statements of openness followed by silence. Assurances followed by defensiveness. Those mismatches matter, because consistency is credibility. And inconsistency invites scrutiny. This is where the focus tightens further. Investigators stop looking for what you say and start looking for what you avoid. Topics you deflect. Details you minimize. Questions you reframe. Those behaviors don't prove anything, but they suggest discomfort. And discomfort always has a source. According to those watching closely, this was the moment the siblings realized something sobering. The truth might not be hidden. It might be fractured, split across perspectives, distorted by fear, filtered through self-preservation. And fractured truth is harder to reconstruct than hidden truth, because you can uncover what's hidden, but you can't easily reconcile what's been reshaped. This realization changed their posture completely. They stopped trying to persuade. They stopped trying to soothe. They focused instead on ensuring that every concern they had was known, documented, acknowledged, impossible to dismiss later. That's not an act of aggression. It's an act of insurance. Insurance against revision. Insurance against erasure. Insurance against being told, years later, that they never spoke up. And that decision marked a point of no ret.